Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today I can basically officially say another month, another Discworld review. I mean, it's only the second one of these books and only the second one of my reviews for the series, but it is basically true because, I'm also going to be reviewing the next 4 books over the next 4 months, optimally speaking, assuming that nothing goes wrong over the second half of 2026. It very well might be the case, but nothing in the first half of 2026 ruined my schedule for Discworld thus far, so we should be okay. In either case, I covered The Color of Magic, the first book in the series, last month as my first foray on the disc, my first trip, my first journey on the little Discworld, so to speak. So be sure to check out that review for my thoughts. I'll link it up there for you guys if you're curious. Overall, I thought that Color of Magic was a very fun time, and I appreciated that book a lot, and I finished that book very much looking forward to the Light Fantastic, and I am glad to say I was right to have high hopes for this because I really enjoyed the Light Fantastic. So let's begin talking slightly more about specifics, but still in a spoiler-free format, starting off with the good like I normally do. And the first thing to note for The Light Fantastic is, of course, that basically everything that I liked about The Color of Magic, the first book in the series, is notably executed better in The Light Fantastic. A lot of the goals and aims of Color of Magic are also to be found in here, and they're all done to a better degree. Most notable of which I do believe is character interactions, particularly any of the interactions having to do with death, of course, but I think that the interactions primarily with Rincewind and Two Flower, and then whatever other tertiary characters are involved alongside them. The first book had a little bit of a third character over a little bit of the story. This book features a couple of other side characters as well, and even though one of those in particular doesn't really have much of anything to do, still the interactions between all the characters in The Light Fantastic are fun and engaging and just really funny, honestly. There's a lot of humor to be found just in little dialogue sequences that occur between characters, interactions between some of the other wizards amongst each other. The main I suppose antagonist of this book is one in particular who's really interesting, and one of the things that makes the characters of Discworld, at least of these first 2 books for me, so fun so far, is that they're all very diverse from one another. You can see in certain points where clear inspirations are being drawn for particular characters, or what kind of I suppose you could say different roles they're meant to embody for the purpose of the parody of the Discworld, right? But even in those cases, all the characters are very diverse and distinct, and executed in a way that are just really fun to follow. So that's one thing that I really enjoyed about Light Fantastic, and that was even better than in The Color of Magic because you had the entire book to actually get really connected with all of these characters, whereas The Color of Magic was structured in a way that made that a little bit harder to do outside of Rincewind and Two Flower directly, so that was another great thing. Some of the other things that Color of Magic did well that I think that The Light Fantastic did even better were just the general, commentary that's on display here. I think Color of Magic did have a couple of moments where it went for something a little bit more thoughtful in its approach as opposed to just strictly humorous, for example, and those were good. They're easy to appreciate when you actually catch them in the text, but, they were not as good as the ones in Light Fantastic. I found a lot of the lines in Light Fantastic. There were a solid handful of them that actually stuck out to me, despite ironically also being more subtle in their approach. They were like, wait a minute, that line was a little bit different than the rest. Let me reread that. And you read it again. It's like, wow, this is actually a really thoughtful line here. I appreciate a lot more than, some of these other lines that are just, straight humor that you read them, you chuckle, and then you move on, right? There were some lines in here that were like, there's something that's actually being said with this line. That's one that I want to think about a little bit more, and I've been told that that's something that Pratchett does even better as he moves along, and, the more books that go along, especially in the, latter portions of the series, he gets even more thoughtful with some things, but, I thought the thoughtful moments in here were already starting to stand out in a way that was like, that's actually really good. And then, of course, now that I also have mentioned things like the humorous lines, the humor is superb in Light Fantastic. It genuinely stepped up a huge notch over The Color of Magic, and I thought The Color of Magic was already fun, but it is more constant, more consistent, and overall just generally much better written in The Light Fantastic. Speaking of, just being much better written in terms of the humor, the entire book in and of itself, just straight up everything about it is written stronger. The actual prose itself, the writing of it, the intensity of it, the subtlety of it, all of it at once just happens to be handled a lot more effectively in The Light Fantastic. So it's like The Color of Magic is basically just a proof of concept for what this type of story on the Discworld could basically be, and Light Fantastic was taking that proof of concept and making it into something really truly standalone, in terms of like its quality. It's not standalone story wise, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Just generally speaking, a lot about The Light Fantastic is doing what The Color of Magic did and doing it better. But I guess we'll, now that I mentioned that, topic of it not being standalone in a story department, there's a lot about The Light Fantastic that is also really good to read because it is a sequel to The Color of Magic. Being a proper sequel with one storyline over the entire book meant that reading this book was really, it was overall a more enjoyable experience than I was kind of expecting after reading The Color of Magic. There was something that I really liked and appreciated about The Color of Magic basically being the format of like 4 novellas that were just stitched together into one. It was basically like a fix-up novel of sorts, and The Light Fantastic is a sequel to The Color of Magic, but it is just one story. It is not split up into multiple different parts, and those parts, even if it was split up into multiple parts, certainly aren't attempting to be more or less standalone like The Color of Magic did. So overall, that just made for a better time with The Light Fantastic, right? So you weren't jumping around between random brief adventures that, didn't really relate to one another beyond whatever connection that Pratchett kind of forced into them, like the previous book did. You also still allowed for some of those references to past moments, to some of those storylines from Color of Magic in here, without having to deal with the structural baggage of it being split into multiple parts in that way. And it also allowed for just generally more smoothly carrying forward with a proper plot attached to it. Color of Magic was interesting because there were those 4 essentially novellas, and those were all fun in their own way. But if you were to ask me like what the point of that book was or what the plot of it was, you couldn't really point to that much. You would just say that it was a book about, the first tourist of Discworld being guided along on a few random adventures basically by an inept wizard, and like that's not really a plot, that's more like a conceit. And while that conceit was fun in The Color of Magic, there's not really a whole lot more to it beyond that. The Light Fantastic does actually have a plot, and it does, borrow from those ideas as set forth in The Color of Magic, and expands them a little bit and properly, brings those forward to actually make it a plot, right? So what The Light Fantastic is basically about is largely dealing with the spell that's stuck in Rincewind's head, and that's an idea that is introduced in The Color of Magic. If you know what I'm talking about. So The Light Fantastic is better than Color of Magic because it is a proper narrative. It has a plot that you can actually point to, rather than The Color of Magic, where you're not really entirely sure a lot of what that book's doing, even though it's fun and it does have those 4 different novellas. What the entire thing is doing is a little bit harder to point out. So that's another thing. Finally, I also want to make sure to just appreciate The Light Fantastic for its focus on making memorable moments within the book that are tied in with that plot, right? Without them feeling quite so random. There are a number of recurring bits over the course of this book that as things go along, they add a lot of fun to the book, right? So the continued plot allows for some of those ideas, some of those funny moments, some of those just interreferential pieces to kind of hit better and to be funnier, the punchlines are more inherent to the book, if that makes any more sense, because of the fact that it is one straight narrative as opposed to being like four different, novellas where you have a bit that might recur throughout that little novella within The Color of Magic, but each of those pieces were short enough that there wasn't like really enough time for anything to yes and, whereas The Light Fantastic has plenty of those yes and moments when it comes particularly to humor. Like I said, I talk about bits, where bit in this particular instance refers to a humorous bit, a comedic type of bit. You probably know what I'm trying to get at here, but that's something that The Light Fantastic does better because it is a full plot. Notably the bits having to do with trees, talking trees specifically, that is also referenced in The Color of Magic, mind you, that being brought forward and continued in The Light Fantastic, and then the way that is also played on when it comes to rocks, for example. Again, if you know the scene from this book that I'm referring to here, it also makes for some really funny moments that are just feel a lot more natural because there's more space and more time for those to kind of weave into and out of the narrative. Just when you think you've forgotten that bit, or when it hasn't come up for a while, it'll be brought up again. It's just like, oh yeah, there's that funny thing again. So it doesn't feel like it's overused, just something that is able to recur a little bit more naturally. I don't know if any of that made sense, but I'm trying my best here. So, basically what it comes down to is like there's still a lot of the chaotic flair in The Light Fantastic that The Color of Magic definitely set forward from some sort of tonal and structural sense, but it's not so much about major whiplash that kind of comes from the multi-novella type of structure. And like I said, just being one straight narrative, you get to follow along with those things, and it feels less quote-unquote random in that proper sense. One final thing to note about The Light Fantastic as well, I nearly forgot to even include this in my notes for the video today. The climax and the resolution of The Light Fantastic are fantastic, pun unintended, I guess. Like, they're just really, really good. I was a big fan of the ending of this book in basically all regards. The last 40 pages, chef's kiss, really, really solid, especially following the ending of The Color of Magic, which is, for all intents and purposes, a major cliffhanger, although there's a little wrinkle that makes that technically not a cliffhanger, which is a pun that you understand if you've read Color of Magic and know how that ends, or if you read The Light Fantastic and know how this starts, because it starts right where Color of Magic ends, ironically. Hence why it is a cliffhanger. But anyway, the details don't really matter. The point that I'm trying to make is the end of The Light Fantastic is really, really, really good, whereas the end of The Color of Magic is just kind of an end. It's like, okay, that was a fun book. I really enjoyed myself. Cool. Light Fantastic starts and ends in a place I was just like, that journey was a proper trip, and I really enjoyed that journey, right? So I just had a lot of fun with Light Fantastic for all of those reasons. That said, let's move on into the bad of The Light Fantastic, and honestly, basically everything that I could say that would fit into the bad for this particular book are mostly just minor nitpicks for the most part. Like, there's one particular thing we'll get to that is slightly less of a nitpick and more of a proper criticism, but basically everything else is so much of a nitpick that honestly I kind of forgot most of those complaints, most of those nitpicks before in between the time of finishing this book a few days ago and composing my notes today. So that's how minor they were to affecting the overall experience, in my opinion. So there's not a whole lot to point out. There are two things that I want to note about The Light Fantastic, but that's it. The first one of those is that there are a couple of jokes that are just straight up repeated near the end of the book, jokes that occur somewhere in the first half or something like that, each of them, and then that appears somewhere in the final act of the book. It's just like, okay, but why did you use the exact same joke here again? And more notably, the exact same joke was used and it was also less effective the second time, not just because it was repeated, but because it wasn't constructed as wittily. So there are a couple of jokes that are repeated here for reasons that don't really make that much sense. Again, a very minor thing. And then another very minor thing is that sometimes the POV hopping, because there's a little bit more POV hopping in The Light Fantastic as you're following a couple storylines, or a couple different, they're not really storylines per se. You could call them that, but the book is so short and the scope so limited that to really call it two different storylines is kind of overselling it. In either case, there are multiple POVs here, and you kind of hop back and forth between some of them pretty quickly in at times where it doesn't feel like it's entirely necessary. You know, the POV hopping is just a little bit more than I feel like is strictly necessary for the purposes of the book. But again, it's such a minor thing that like nobody's really going to make that much of a complaint. It's you know, not bad. It doesn't make the book bad at all. It doesn't ruin the experience in any way, shape, or form. But with a book as short as this is, you know, to have as much POV hopping as it has in certain sections is a little bit surprising nonetheless. So that's just something that, you know, bad, but very minor nitpick, you know, especially when you consider that the longer scenes, you know, all the scenes that are like 10 plus pages, especially the 15 plus page scenes are like easily the best scenes in the book. There's a handful of those. So when there's more lengthier scenes going on, I guess, in the book, it's more fun. It's more engaging. The hopping between scenes frequently sometimes doesn't allow for there to be enough time with some of those scenes to really like sink in. So I guess that's the point of the nitpick, is to say that some of the scenes you might have to read a couple times for you to actually know what happened. This was kind of a point that I appreciated a lot about Color of Magic, was just how efficient the prose was. I basically said that as both a good and as a bad thing, because the bad side of it is that if you happen to not be paying attention for even just a single sentence, that sentence might be important enough as like a switch in what's going on for you to have absolutely no idea what's going on anymore, because you did not actually really register what that one sentence said. The Light Fantastic continues that kind of thing, but at a slightly broader scope. Like, you're not going to be completely thrown off by missing a single sentence quite as often in the Light Fantastic, but there are a couple of scenes that are short enough where if you miss a sentence or a paragraph of that short scene, you have no idea what even happened in the entire scene because you missed the entire setup of it, right? So it's just continuing that kind of, the sheer efficiency of the prose might be a little bit of a problem with some of the POV hopping just because of how short some of those scenes are. I guess that's the general point of that. Again, very minor critique, but it is a critique nonetheless. I figured I ought to shout it out. The final one of my complaints, however, is going to be a little bit more proper of a criticism. This is going to move us on into the ugly of the Light Fantastic, and that is definitely the most objective problem with the Light Fantastic, and that is that there are some things in this book, following up on the Color of Magic, especially as it being a proper sequel to the Color of Magic, that are just straight up retcons. You know, Pratchett has a handful of retcons in here to varying degrees of severity. There are a couple that are just very minor and just like whatever, it doesn't really matter. But there are a couple that are a lot more noticeable, and some of these are more justifiable than not. Some of these I think probably should have been addressed in some way for them to not feel as weird, I suppose you could say. For example, one of these things is like the fact that Two Flower has a little bit less trouble communicating with most of the major characters in this book compared to the first one, despite the language barrier thing. And that's one of those things like, yeah, you could basically overlook that and just infer that, hey, he's been touristing basically for like a year or something like that. Let's just assume that he has implicitly learned a little bit more of the primary language that people speak here, so it's not that much of a problem. You know, you can overlook that a little bit, even though it feels like it's in a slight, you know, direct conflict to an extent with the Color of Magic. But it's not that major, right? But the real issue for me is one particular retcon, and that is to do with the number 8. In the Color of Magic, you are basically you're told straight up that the number 8 is basically an evil number, that you're never ever supposed to say it, especially not if you're a wizard. It is, you know, the Color of Evil. There's an entire one of those 4 novellas, basically, that make up the Color of Magic, is like a sort of Lovecraftian type of scene, basically, where the number 8 is at the center of the whole Lovecraftian horror of what happens in that scene. But then the number 8 is completely flipped on its head in the Light Fantastic, and instead of being an evil number, the number 8 is the magic number. It is the number that basically everything magically related, you know, is based around. Octarine is the 8th color. Basically, it is the color of magic. And suddenly in the Light Fantastic, like everything to do with, you know, the Unseen University and stuff is built on like numbers of 8. Like there's a staircase there that is made up of 8,888 steps, like this kind of thing, right? So the number 8, whereas before it was an evil number that you were never ever supposed to say, not even think about it, now all of a sudden 8 is the number that everything magically related is built upon, and that's a good thing. And this is not addressed in any way, shape, or form in the book. Like it's just something that has changed seemingly randomly. I thought that I might have been going crazy reading this book. Just like, did I just like miss something, like following that novella in the previous book that like explained why the number 8 is suddenly a good number, the magic number, in fact, instead of this evil number that you're not supposed to say? No, it's just never addressed. And like, that's one of those things you probably should have addressed that, and breaking the fourth wall to some degree to address that in one way or another is something that Pratchett could very well have gotten away with in The Light Fantastic. But with this being a sequel to The Color of Magic and suddenly flipping this world building thing completely on its head and using it as a pretty major world building element in this book was actually very distracting at certain points. I had to, message my one of my buddies who's Discworld is his favorite series, right? He was the one who was able to warm me up to the idea of reading the series in the first place. I had to ask him, it's just like, did I miss something? Or what's going on with the number 8? Why was it evil and now it's not? And he's like, it's just something that Pratchett apparently changed his mind on and then never said anything about again. One of those things where if you read multiple Discworld books and then you go back to The Color of Magic, you'll notice it and be like, well, that's weird. But as somebody who started with The Color of Magic and moved on, it's just like, this probably should have been addressed to some degree. So like, that's the ugly of The Light Fantastic, is that there are some retcons, some of them more justifiable than not, some of them more noticeable than not, or rather than others, I suppose is probably the way to put both those sentences. But in either case, I don't love retconning. Retconning is one of my least favorite things that a person can do. I accept this particular retcon with regards to the number 8. I think that it works better as a magic number, like conceptually. I like that idea better than it being an evil number. But it was a very noticeable thing that bothered me at multiple points in my read through until I asked somebody to make sure that I wasn't going crazy. So that's one of those things. In either case, that is going to take us into the recommendation of The Light Fantastic, and I'm happy to say that this is actually a fairly cut and dry recommendation compared to The Color of Magic, where, when I recommended that book, I was basically like, I don't know if I really properly recommend this, especially as somebody who's only read The Color of Magic. Like, would I recommend this as a starting place? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know, because I haven't read any of the other books. Light Fantastic is a much easier book for me to just say yes or no to recommend, right? I think that if you have read The Color of Magic, you should read The Light Fantastic, more or less regardless of how you felt about The Color of Magic, even if you weren't quite sure about it, right? Definitely read The Light Fantastic, because it is better than The Color of Magic in every way, and it continues and finishes the story of it, right? So it actually makes a proper plot to satisfy and pay off a lot of the ideas that are put forth throughout The Color of Magic. So Light Fantastic is going to be satisfying for multiple reasons on that count. And, like I said, it's just better. It is actually a proper narrative. Those things combined mean that you should read The Light Fantastic if you have read The Color of Magic. If, however, you have not read The Color of Magic and you're wondering if you should pick up The Light Fantastic, like, say, as your first Discworld book, I guess you technically could. It's standalone enough to work out, and where things are referenced from The Color of Magic that are, like, the most important for the plot of it, those things are told to you in this book, so you don't really have to have read Color of Magic. But because of those references, even though some of those things are explained, you could if you wanted to. I don't necessarily recommend it. If you skipped The Color of Magic, you do, technically avoid some of the retcon issues that I just told you about here. But I do think that you will appreciate the payoffs of the story of The Light Fantastic a little bit more if you have read The Color of Magic. So I do think that you should definitely read The Light Fantastic either way. But yeah, so like that's my recommendations. I recommend this book. I had such a fun time with this. I had a heck of a lot of fun with it. It is really good. So, whether or not you've read The Color of Magic, I do recommend this. Although I basically do recommend reading Color of Magic before this because it is basically the first half of it. So that is my thoughts on The Light Fantastic overall. As for like a brief little quote-unquote ranking of the series so far, even though I've only read 2 books, I guess I'll just put like up in the top corner over there or something. Rated at 4 out of 5 stars, I put The Light Fantastic on top, and then in second place for now is The Color of Magic, which I'm rating at 3 out of 5 stars. I had that rated at 3.5 at first, which I just rounded down to 3 for the purposes of Goodreads, but over the course of reading The Light Fantastic, I decided to just straight up knock The Color of Magic down to 3 out of 5 straight up. All of these ratings are subject to change. Rankings are subject to change. As I read each book, I will rank and basically rate them in the corner as I feel fit, as I feel like I need to, and I will adjust ratings and rankings as, time goes on, because I'm allowed to do that. Like I said, subject to change, but that is going to be the ranking for now, and that is going to be the end of this second Discworld review. I did not anticipate this review being of a similar length as the first one. Both of these were much longer than I expected them to be, so I'm sorry / you're welcome, whichever one of those you prefer. Second Discworld book down, second Discworld review down. Very excited to be continuing with the series next month. Equal Rights is next, and I will be reading that, and then Mort, and then Sorcery, and Weird Sisters. I'll read all 4 of those next books through the next 4 months, basically, and as long as nothing goes wrong, I will be reviewing each of those books over those next 4 months as well, just the way that I have with these first couple. So that is the plan. If anybody's, still curious to hop along the train with me and read some of these next couple of books, Patrick, you're reading Equal Rights with us since you haven't read it yet, by the way. But otherwise, thank you for watching this video. I really, really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.